The ground floor of the Grand Aveline Hotel remained as composed as ever, polished marble floors, the soft clinking of silver spoons against porcelain cups, and waitstaff moving in a perfectly choreographed silence born of rigorous training. But at the VIP table, near the end of the lobby, the one always reserved for those who never wait in line, the air was unmistakably different. Dante Vale sat motionless, his fingers gripping a Montblanc pen so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. In front of him was a $3 billion merger agreement unraveling into chaos with a maze of convoluted clauses, complex enough that even legal advisors from Stanford and Columbia had begun to second-guess themselves. With every page he turned, Dante felt another ounce of control slipping away, something he had never allowed to happen, not for a single second throughout his entire career. What he felt wasn't quite anger, it was something more unsettling: doubt. Doubt in himself. And then amid that breathless tension, something unexpected happened. Not from the legal team, but from the waitress, quietly placing another cup of hot espresso on the table. Lyra Quinn didn't lift her head, but her eyes didn't flinch. Her voice was soft, barely more than a breath, yet unmistakably precise. If they can't make sense of this clause, I might be able to help. For a fraction of a second, everything seemed to stop. Dante's initial reaction wasn't fury, it was surprise, quickly turning into suspicion. A girl in an apron standing in the midst of a table full of tailored suits had just said something utterly implausible, but instead of dismissing her, he looked at her closer now, as if trying to figure out whether this was a prank or a breach in the perfectly controlled world he had built. Lyra didn't back down. She knew exactly where she was standing, knew exactly what kinds of eyes were now aimed at her. But she also knew too well what it felt like to not be believed. And in that moment, a forgotten emotion stirred inside Dante: fear of being seen. This girl, with one quiet sentence, had struck the very nerve he most wanted hidden. He was out of his depth. And worse, she knew it. No one said anything else. But they didn't need to, because Dante's slight, almost involuntary nod was the first admission. From that moment on, the game would never be the same. Dante Vale wasn't used to waiting for others to explain things to him. At Vale Tech Global, the empire he had built from nothing but two bare hands and a malfunctioning line of code, back in 1999, every final decision bore his fingerprint. The media called him the signal tamer, because everything he touched, from security technology to satellite data transmission chains, reshaped the trajectory of global markets. But today, at the auxiliary meeting table in the cafe lounge of the Grand Aveline Hotel, he was staring at a 172-page contract and Clause 9.6. Specifically, the phrase "mutual suspension of control" had brought him to a halt. Even the finest lawyer's money could buy were now flipping through pages with the delicacy of someone diffusing explosives. The more he read, the more it felt like gazing into a labyrinth built from the very language of power. Only this time, he didn't hold the map. Once a man who solved everything with logic and speed, Dante now began to feel something that had never made its way into his schedule: helplessness. But he didn't show it. He couldn't afford to. Not when Helix Systems, his greatest rival, was waiting for his response. Not when the press was counting down the hours to the biggest merger of the year. And especially not when, from across the room, a waitress had just looked him in the eye and said, "If they can't make sense of this clause, I might be able to help." That sentence still echoed. Part of him wanted to ignore it, but another part, the one that had survived 2 financial crises, an internal leak, and an ethics lawsuit, paused just for a moment and asked, what did she see that I didn't? For the first time in years, Dante Vale The man who had trained an entire industry never to question him was forced to confront a truth not easily accepted, maybe this time. He needed a pair of eyes that didn't wear a suit to find the way out. Under the warm amber glow of the cafe counter, where billion-dollar contracts usually pass by like fleeting rumors, Lyra Quinn pulled out a chair and sat down at the table. She didn't ask for permission, didn't wait for an invitation. She simply flipped through the contract as if it were an IKEA manual, straightforward, structured, and nothing to be afraid of. Her eyes skimmed swiftly over the sections, her head tilted slightly, her fingers tapping rhythmically along the lines of text. Not a bead of sweat, not a flicker of fear. On the contrary, there was something in her expression, almost like regret. Clause 9.6. This is a trap. Her voice didn't waver. She spoke as if recounting a story. If Valetech's stock drops by 2% or more after the merger, Helix has the right to withdraw without facing any penalties. No reimbursement, no compensation. A silence fell, like a gavel. Dante squinted. His lead attorney began flipping back through the pages, his face paling. Another advisor frowned as if preparing a rebuttal but said nothing. In other words, Lyra lifted her gaze, locking eyes with Dante. You could lose the entire company and get nothing in return. That truth wasn't a knife, it was a slow twist. Gentle, precise, and bloodless. But the consequences were unmistakable. And the cruelest part, the one who spoke wasn't a lawyer, not a paid consultant, but a waitress in an apron, just coming off a night shift, living on tips, and learning the law by simply listening to conversations across tables. No one laughed, no one objected. Dante, the man who had called her sweetheart just minutes earlier, remained silent. Not because he had nothing to say, but because this time he knew he needed to listen. Anyone watching from a security camera or a leaked recording would see one thing with crystal clarity. Intelligence doesn't wear a necktie, and respect sometimes is earned by the courage to keep your head up. Dante couldn't hide his surprise. He leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes fixed on the girl who had just dismantled a multi-billion-dollar contract like a morning Sudoku. He tilted his head, and for the first time in years, his voice dropped to a tone of sincerity. No commands, no dominance, just a man genuinely wanting to understand. Where did you learn all this? Lyra didn't hesitate. No evasion, no shame like those who feared judgment for having imperfect resumes. She looked at him, startlingly direct. MIT, Systems and Data Security, dropped out in sophomore year. A pause. Then she continued, her tone flat, as if she'd repeated this story enough times to know no one ever found it worth hearing. My mother was diagnosed with late-stage liver cancer. My little brother was 9, had mild epilepsy. No one else. I had no choice but to leave schoolwork and keep them alive. Washed dishes by day. At night, I rewrote everything I'd ever learned. Then started learning more. From scratch. She pulled out her phone and opened an app with an incredibly sleek interface. This is what I'm testing. A real-time data sync protocol across security layers without traditional tiered architecture. She tapped the demo. On the screen, data packets moved, processed, and auto-responded to unauthorized access without needing a central server. A mechanism that Valetech's R&D team had spent 18 months trying to build unsuccessfully. Dante froze. He stared at the screen, then back at the girl in front of him, who minutes ago had been pouring coffee, and he realized something with absolute clarity. This wasn't just a smart girl. This was a genius derailed by circumstance. Someone who hadn't been given a chance, so she built one with dish-soaked hands and sleepless nights lit by a flickering monitor. And for the first time, he felt fear. Not fear of her, but fear of the fact that he and the entire system he stood atop had almost overlooked a diamond like this, simply because she didn't have a diploma. Dante didn't ask anything else. He simply stared at Lyra for a long moment, then without a word, set his pen down and pushed the contract aside, as if it had become obsolete the moment she started speaking. His entire posture, usually forged from steel, in high-stakes deals, softened. His eyes no longer looked like those of a CEO assessing a candidate, but like a man who had just witnessed something far beyond every model he'd ever built. "You have what Valetech lacks," he said, voice low and stripped of his usual arrogance. "Heart and a battle-tested mind. I'll invest, and you'll lead." Lyra wasn't surprised. She simply nodded, as if she had been waiting for those words her entire life, not for the fame, not for the money, but because finally, someone saw her, not through her apron or transcript, but through her true worth. She set her phone down, her gaze steady. "I accept, but on two conditions. First, you don't call me sweetheart. Second, I retain full control over the technical side. Every line of code goes through me. I'm not selling an idea, I'm building it. No one on the legal team dared to breathe too loudly." And Dante. He smiled. Not the triumphant smile he usually wore, but something softer, almost relieved, as if at last he had found someone capable of what an entire generation of engineers had failed to deliver. "Good. Then it's a deal." He extended his hand. Lyra took it without hesitation. A firm handshake, no trembling, no fear. No need for a power suit, no letters of recommendation. Just a former dishwasher, now sitting as an equal with an empire. And that moment, if replayed, would become the opening frame of every future lesson. You don't need to be invited. You just need to be too good to ignore. The project, named Nova Bridge, wasn't launched in glass-walled, marble-trimmed offices or million-dollar labs. It began in Lyra's cramped apartment, where the dining table doubled as a data coordination hub, and the glow of a blue screen lit up eyes accustomed to sleepless nights. Dante Vale, a man who had only ever worked with minds branded by Ivy League credentials, now sat across from a girl in an old t-shirt, hair tied up, hastily typing lines of code, as if rewriting the very nature of trust in the digital age. He gradually realized he was stepping into a universe he had never touched before, a world where women washed dishes, taught their younger siblings, and debugged programs with a precision that even Valetech's senior engineers would tread lightly around. He had once believed genius was born in laboratories, on scholarships, in competitions funded by corporations. But here, in front of him, stood a genius forged through unpaid bills, prescription meds for a sick mother, and mornings without coffee, still coding until sunlight pierced through the blinds. Lyra didn't work to impress. She worked because she wouldn't allow herself to fail, not for recognition, but because in the next room, her mother rested under an IV drip, and her younger brother Aiden was learning through the very app his sister had built. "If the system lags, I lose signal right in the middle of the lecture," Aiden said, with a soft smile as Lyra tested the data stream again. Dante's first visit to Lyra's family wasn't with envelopes or assistance. He came with a box of pastries from a famous shop near Valetech's headquarters. He sat beside Mrs. Quinn, a frail woman whose proud eyes seemed to say, "I couldn't give my child a degree, but I taught her never to bow before injustice." And for the first time, in the heart of a man who once believed every problem could be solved with strategy, another truth began to rise. Some technologies aren't born in research labs. They are born from love, from responsibility, and from those who choose to stand when the world expected them to fall. Nova Bridge officially launched on an autumn morning in Geneva, inside the main hall of the world's largest tech conference. The room fell silent as the main screen displayed the platform's data transmission simulation, a real-time decentralized security system with no bottlenecks, no vulnerabilities, and no room for manipulation. A child in Mumbai could call their mother in a Syrian refugee camp through a platform even the best hackers couldn't break into. Lyra Quinn, 30 years old, hair tied high, wearing a simple white shirt, stepped onto the stage, not as a scientist nor a CEO, but as someone who once worked night shifts in a cafe, now standing beneath lights that were never meant for her. The press dubbed her the sleepless coder, the girl who stayed awake because no one helped her dream. And now she stood there, not to claim glory, but to return hope to those who once stood where she did. She declined every offer to relocate, despite being able to live in any penthouse in the world. My mum's used to her old kitchen. She knows the taste of porridge from a gas stove better than any dish from an induction range. Lyra founded Q Scholarship, a program for students who had to drop out due to family poverty, illness, or simply being forgotten by the world. The scholarship didn't ask for transcripts, just a piece of code, a sketch, or a poem written in the corner of a rented room. And Dante, the man who once built Vailtech on rigid standards and pristine resumes, announced a new hiring policy at the launch. We will recruit from places no one has ever looked: boarding houses, dormitories, public libraries, rural towns. Because genius doesn't need coordinates. It just needs to be heard. The room rose to its feet, not for the grandeur of the technology, but because they saw themselves in the story. For once in a lifetime, those who had been erased from the list of opportunities didn't need permission to rise. They only needed to rise, and the world had no choice but to clear the way. That morning in New York was unusually warm. The sky was clearer than it had been in years, as if the city itself were holding its breath, waiting for something unlike the polished tributes it had grown so used to. Inside the Grand Hall of the Global Technology Conference, the spotlight narrowed onto two figures: Dante Vale, the powerful billionaire who once commanded the flow of global data, and Lyra Quinn, the girl who emerged from the shadows of late-night shifts, carrying a brilliance no one had noticed and a heart no one had cared to ask about. Dante spoke first, but this time he didn't deliver a speech. He didn't cite growth metrics, didn't talk about strategy, didn't even mention success. He simply lifted a glass, his eyes scanning the audience filled with CEOs, investors, professors, and children invited from low-income housing blocks. To underestimate people, he said. Every time we ignored a name because it wasn't familiar. To every mind we overlooked because it wasn't dressed for the occasion. The room fell completely silent. Lyra stepped forward. No music played, no introduction, echoed no titles, followed her name. Just her presence alone pulled every gaze toward her, like gravity. She raised her glass. Her voice was not loud, not trembling, but it rang. To prove them wrong. Every time I was called a dreamer. Every time they said I didn't have the profile. And to everyone sitting here today who's ever been told they didn't belong just because no one looked at them the right way. No one clapped. But in that stillness was something greater than applause, acknowledgement. There were no polite smiles, no early exits. Everyone in that room understood. What they had just witnessed wasn't a celebration of success, but a transfer of values. That day, the world didn't change because of a new technology. It changed because an old truth was proven again, undeniably. Those who were once underestimated are rewriting the rules, and they don't need permission to do it. Beneath the soft golden lights of the La Fontaine Hotel lobby, a place where power gathered and contracts were sealed with glances, Lyra Quinn moved quietly between tables with a silver tray in hand. No one paid attention to her. She was part of the background, like spotless glassware, or the faint jazz drifting from hidden speakers. But at the VIP table in the back of the room, where lawyers wearing watches worth 4 years of Harvard tuition whispered over a thick contract, something was starting to crack. Dante Vale, CEO of Vale Tech, and the most powerful man in secure data transmission, frowned, tapping his fingers slowly on the table as a vague clause in the agreement with Helix Systems left his entire advisory team perplexed. Lyra approached and placed an espresso gently in front of Dante. She glanced at the contract for just a second, then said something that silenced the entire table. If you're hesitating over Section 9.6, it's probably because of the wording. I've seen a similar version. It's usually an exit condition, without penalty, if the partner's stock drops more than 2%. Silence. Heads began to lift from papers. A waitress explaining financial clauses. Dante squinted, half annoyed, half intrigued. Where'd you learn that? Don't tell me it was from the coffee machine. Lyra didn't blink. MIT. Didn't finish, but I kept studying every night. While others sleep, I study machine languages. When they party, I debug. Dante stared at her for longer than a breath. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone without a title. But he wasn't the kind of man to ignore genius just because it wore an apron. Moments later, instead of dismissing her, Dante pushed the papers aside. Show me the app you're building. When the phone screen lit up, the doubt in his eyes slowly faded. A clean interface, seamless. A real-time data sync system without layered architecture, exactly what Vale Tech had been desperately searching for. And then, he looked up. No more suspicion, just certainty. I'll invest, you'll lead. Lyra replied crisply, I accept, but I retain full technical control, and you don't call me sweetheart. In that very moment, a waitress stepped out of the shadows, and the entire tech industry began to rise. Inside, a neon-lit office on the 28th floor of the Insight Tribune, Celeste Marin, the investigative journalist who had taken down 3 CEOs and exposed 2 international money laundering rings, paused as her eyes landed on the latest Time magazine cover. Lyra Quinn, the sleepless coder, the girl who sent shockwaves through the tech world, who forced Vale Tech to rewrite its entire hiring policy. But for Celeste, something didn't add up. Not the interview, not the achievements. It was the girl's eyes, the look she wore. A look Celeste saw every morning in the mirror. Curiosity turned to obsession. Celeste began typing into the National Identity Database. No hospital records, no elementary school transcripts. A blurred birth certificate with the district misrecorded. No registered guardians, no fixed address during the first 12 years of life. How could someone like that even exist? She started combing through old files, tens of thousands of reports on children abandoned, swapped, or missing in the 1990s. Then a single entry made her shoot upright in her chair. Lyra Quinn born. March 14th, same day, same year, same city as Celeste herself. More than that, a facial sketch pulled from pediatric medical data looked so much like her, it sent chills down her spine. Celeste had never had a sister. She was sure of it. But then why? Was her heart racing when she looked at Lyra? And in that moment, it was no longer a story about a tech phenomenon. It became a question that cut through the very soul of a journalist who had always trusted only data. If the world had stolen her childhood, then am I living a life that was meant for both of us? Celeste drove to Green Hollow, a small town over 3 hours from New York, a place she had never intended to return to. Her mother once told her it held nothing but hazy memories and a decaying, abandoned house. But this time, she wasn't chasing memories. She was chasing the truth. At the local civil records office, she searched through birth logs for March 14th of that year. And there, in a dust-covered folder, the entry hit her like a slap to her belief system: twins, baby A and baby B. A massive fire had broken out at Westmore Hospital the very day they were born. Many records were destroyed. One child, baby A, was taken by a couple named Marin during the chaos. Baby B was marked as missing. No one followed up. No DNA checks. Everyone believed only one baby had survived. Celeste froze. Her hand trembled as she held up a faded photo. Two newborn girls lying side by side. Tags reading A and B. One baby was being cradled. The other, left behind in the mayhem. "This can't be," she whispered. But deep within her chest, where her heart had always beaten for justice for the first time, it beat for something more personal. A memory that had never been allowed to exist. A sister, a missing half of her soul, who had lived an entirely different life. Celeste sat in her car just a block away from the cafe Lyra frequented. Through the fogged-up glass, she quietly watched the girl walking briskly, wearing an old but tidy coat, carrying a laptop and a few cheap groceries. No one knew she was the genius behind Nova Bridge, and no one knew she was meant to live a different life. Since discovering the truth, Celeste hadn't slept soundly. Every time she closed her eyes, Lyra's face appeared in her mind like a mirror, reflecting her own, but etched with invisible scars: losing a mother too soon, growing up with a poor adoptive family self-taught, navigating a cold world without anyone to guide her. Celeste had everything: loving parents, a good education, opportunities Lyra had never even known to dream of. And now, she didn't know whether she should hand over the truth or let it rest quietly in the dark. If I tell her, will she hate me? Will she feel like her childhood was stolen? Or worse, like she doesn't belong anywhere at all? Torn Celeste wrote dozens of emails only to delete every one. Each time her fingers reached for the truth, fear surged, fear not of losing her reputation, but of losing something she never had before, a family she had just found and couldn't bring herself to claim. The question carved deeper into her every day: stay silent to protect, or speak up to connect. 1 month after the signing with Tech, Lyra Quinn was no longer an unfamiliar name. She appeared on the front page of Tech World, dubbed the waitress who broke Silicon Valley's rules. But not every spotlight is warm, and not every gaze comes with admiration. Online conversations exploded. Did she really study at MIT? Has anyone verified her background? Probably just another PR stunt from Dante Vale. A well-known blogger even wrote a genius no one's ever heard of. Sounds like the plot of a cheap novel. The cutting line was shared by hundreds of thousands. Lyra tried to focus on her work, but every time she opened her laptop, every time she spoke in front of the engineering team, she could feel the undercurrent of doubt. No one said it to her face, but they always double-checked her decisions. Even when her logic was clear, even when her code was clean, she still had to prove herself 3 times more than anyone else. One evening, after returning from the lab, she stood in front of the mirror in her small apartment. The yellow light, cast across her face, showed her something she didn't recognize: a stranger. Why am I afraid? She asked herself. Not afraid of failure, not afraid of broken tech, but afraid that one day the world would see her as a fraud, as a dream, too beautiful to be real. She lowered her head onto the table, her hand gripping the Nova data folder. Not to cry, but to reaffirm a quiet promise in her heart: I won't back down. Not because I need them to believe, but because I need to stop doubting. Valetech's IPO was approaching a billion-dollar milestone that required absolute transparency. As someone who never let emotion cloud reason, Dante instructed the legal team to conduct a full background check on every key executive, including Lyra. The report on his desk wasn't long, but it raised red flags. No official birth certificate before the age of 7. No complete academic records before middle school. No listed mother or father. Only a string of temporary residences, orphanage files, and blurry school transfer documents. A genius, grown from a void. Dante said nothing to Lyra. No questioning, no accusations. But he knew if there was anything buried in her past that could explode and shatter everything they had, to be one step ahead of it. He assigned someone to dig deeper, and on a gray, rainy afternoon in Brooklyn, he arrived at the office of an investigative journalist, Celeste Moran. Unlike sensationalist reporters, Celeste didn't smile, didn't offer a handshake. She looked at him with a tension that suggested both of them stood at the edge of a secret too big to carry alone. Mr. Vale, I know why you're here, and I think we're both following the same person. What do you know about Lyra Quinn? Celeste took a deep breath. Not just know, I think she might be my twin sister. Dante didn't take his eyes off Celeste. In that moment, power technology assets all faded into the background. In front of him stood a truth that could reshape not only the company's valuation, but redefine everything he believed about Lyra Quinn. A rising undercurrent was forming, and Dante understood. He couldn't control the wind, but he could choose who deserved to face the truth first. The meeting room on the 42nd floor held only 2 people, Celeste, the journalist once known as the sledgehammer of truth, and Dante Vale, the man who never sat at a negotiating table unless he held every card. Celeste didn't bring a recorder. She didn't come as a reporter, just a woman carrying a truth far too heavy to bear alone. "She's my sister Dante," she said, her voice trembling, but her gaze steady. "I know it doesn't change what she's doing today, but if even a part of you still doubts, let me say this clearly: Lyra Quinn is not a fraud. She is real, and if anything was stolen in this life, it was stolen by fate." Dante remained silent for a long time. He didn't mention the IPO, didn't talk about financial risk. He just looked out the window, where the skyline was awash in gold from the setting sun, then turned back and asked, "Does Lyra know?" Celeste shook her head. "No. I'm afraid if I tell her, she'll break. Or worse, she'll think everything she built came from some blood tie, not from her own strength." Dante nodded. "So, you're not going to write the story?" Celeste met his eyes. "I'm a journalist, but before that, I'm a sister, and some stories don't belong on the front page." Between them lay an agreement. No contracts, no signatures, but held by a profound respect. Dante left that meeting with something he hadn't expected. He began to see Lyra not just as a rising partner, but as someone worth protecting. Not because she was fragile, but because he had seen it. Behind those bright eyes and a mind capable of rewriting an entire industry was a child once abandoned by the very world she was now rebuilding. And he promised himself, if no one stayed for her back then, he would be the first to stay now. On a quiet Monday morning, before sunlight had fully crept through the window of Lyra's small apartment, her email inbox lit up with a single subject line: "The Woman They Forgot to Name," by Celeste Moran. Lyra opened the article out of habit, but the more she read, the more her hands began to tremble. The words weren't just headlines anymore. They were fragments of her own life told with a voice so raw, so understanding, it hurt to breathe. About a nameless child in the Westmore Hospital fire. About a family that was meant to be shared, but could only raise one, about a sister who had lived feeling grateful for life, while her twin had grown up in the shadow of being forgotten. And then, the article ended not with a conclusion for readers, but with a whisper, meant only for her. Lyra, if you're reading this, know that I never stopped searching for you. And if you're willing, I'm waiting, right outside. Lyra didn't cry at first. She just sat there quietly. The computer screen still glowed, the cursor blinking between lines of half-written code. Not until the door opened, Celeste stood there in an old trench coat, no makeup, no journalistic spotlight, just a sister with eyes rimmed red. Lyra said nothing. She walked forward. And for the first time in 26 years, the two twin sisters, who had lived as if from entirely separate worlds, held each other not for closure, not for answers, but for one undeniable truth: they had found each other. Lyra's voice cracked like winter wind. You know, I'm not angry. I just wish you'd found me a little sooner. Celeste tightened her embrace. I wish that too. Every single day. It wasn't a dramatic reunion. No cameras, no press. Just two souls, once strangers now whole, learning how to love each other from the beginning. And for Lyra, it became the greatest turning point of her life. For the first time, she was no longer alone. The old Westmore Hospital building, now nothing more than crumbling walls and dust-covered hallways, had long been abandoned. But to Celeste and Lyra, it wasn't rubble. It was a beginning. They entered from opposite ends, as if symbolizing two lives separated too soon. Lyra dressed simply, holding a small, weathered photograph of their mother. Celeste carried a bouquet of lavender, the flower their birth mother once grew behind the little house in Green Hollow, according to the records they now both knew were true. No words were exchanged at first, only a quiet meeting of eyes, no longer hesitant. Then Lyra stepped forward. She didn't need an apology, and Celeste didn't need to explain. They embraced not with the shattering emotion of their first reunion, but with a healing softness, quiet, deep, as if years of storms had finally calmed, just to allow two women, once torn apart by fate, to call each other by the simplest word, sister. In one corner of the room, they laid the bouquet down and wrote a single line on the wall with a black ink marker for what was lost and now found. Lyra turned to Celeste with a gentle smile. We can't go back and rewrite our childhood, but we can write the rest of our adulthood for both of us. Celeste nodded. Not like strangers crossing paths, but like two halves finally made whole. No apologies were needed, because for them, forgiveness had already lived in that first embrace where memories were no longer stolen, but restored through truth and sisterhood. On an open-air stage, beneath the soft light of late afternoon and rows of children in colorful uniforms, Lyra stepped up to the microphone. Beside her stood Celeste with a camera hanging from her neck, and Dante silent behind the curtain, watching like a proud father. The large banner behind them read, Gen 1, Ignite What Was Ignored. This wasn't just a scholarship fund. It wasn't a startup. Gen 1 was the world's first digital ecosystem created specifically for abandoned children, a space where they could learn to code, design, AI build blockchain systems, all using donated second-hand phones from major corporations. The story of Lyra and Celeste, twin sisters once separated by fate, one raised by the system, the other forgotten entirely, was now part of the curriculum used as a case study to inspire. And when Lyra spoke that line on stage, every child fell into a hush. Talent isn't about where you're born. It's about how brave you are to rise from where the world left you behind. From the crowd, a little girl with frizzy hair stood up. She raised her hand and asked Miss Lyra, if I don't have anyone, can I still join Ben 1? Lyra smiled, leaning gently toward her. You don't have anyone, only because you haven't found them yet. But starting today, Celeste, Dante, and I will be the first ones there when you begin. And I promise we'll be the someone you can call by name. Applause erupted not for a hero, but for the first generation that was finally seen. Gen 1 wasn't just about giving kids access to technology. It was about showing them they've always been worthy of it. At the International AI Technology Conference in Tokyo, an event where all eyes typically focus on data charts, growth metrics, and cutting-edge machine learning models, Dante Vale stepped onto the stage with an expression that was uncharacteristically soft, not cold, not commanding, but deeply reflective. There were no slides, no technical diagrams, just a single image on the massive LED screen, a photo of Lyra, the waitress who once served coffee, alongside the caption, the one they almost missed. Dante looked down at the audience, filled with tech CEOs, leading scholars, and political dignitaries. Then he began slowly. I used to believe that to change the world, you needed the best minds from the most prestigious schools with the most flawless credentials, until a waitress handed me a correction to a $3.2 billion contract. She wasn't just sharper than my legal team. She showed me something deeper. Genius doesn't come from financial centers. It comes from the overlooked corners of the world, the places we've never bothered to kneel down and truly listen. The entire hall fell silent. He continued, his voice steady and resonant. Starting today, ValeTech will remove degree requirements from all hiring processes. We will invest in rural communities, orphanages, and underrepresented minorities. Because if we fail to find genius there, maybe we're the ones who lack vision. Then he paused, offering a quiet smile, his eyes searching for someone in the crowd. A girl whose childhood was stolen once taught me there are no nameless people, only systems that haven't yet learned how to see. From politics to humanity, Dante wasn't just changing a company, he was changing how the world defines human worth. Who are they, the children? No one names, no one waits for the ones not born into the world with a kind welcome. They don't have birth certificates, not because they weren't born, but because the world chose to ignore their existence from the very first breath. No medical records, no first day of school, no yearbook photos. No one ever asked, "What do you dream of becoming?" They grew up as shadows in a brightly lit society, pushed into forgotten corners, without teachers, without homes, without anyone to watch over them as they slept. Some became cheap labor in dim factories, their ink-stained fingers forced to count products instead of letters. Some were moved from one orphanage to another, each transfer stripping away another piece of trust until nothing remained to believe in. Some were painfully brilliant, sensitive to numbers, to sound, to language, but were labeled behavioral problems simply because they didn't know how to compress grief into the shape of discipline. And then there are people like Lyra Quinn, a name that sounds ordinary, but whose entire childhood was a journey to find out if she even existed. She once believed she was a glitch in the system, a faulty variable that didn't belong in the structured logic of life. While other children learned to dream, she learned to be silent. While her peers chose future careers, she simply learned how to survive through endless nights, extra shifts, moments of holding her breath, as her mother coughed, uncontrollably unsure whether to buy medicine or rice. She never thought anyone would remember her. She was never once called by her true name, in a voice that was gentle and affirming. Not until one day, when the world still believed she was just the coffee girl on the ground floor, she stepped onto the stage of a global tech summit, looked out at thousands of faces that had once defined the world and told her story. Not for pity, but to say we were once stripped of our names, erased from the map of what is possible. But we never disappeared. We were just waiting for someone to finally see us for the humans we've always been. And that was the moment the entire room stood up, not because Lyra was a genius, but because she was the voice of millions of nameless children who had never been called. Lyra never knew who had named her. All she knew was that the name had been scribbled into a temporary medical file at what was once an emergency outpost following the Westmore Hospital fire. No birth certificate, no official medical records, no photo to mark her arrival into the world. Just a name that survived with her through countless freezing winters. Each morning before heading to her early shift at the cafe beneath a towering building, Lyra would open the learning app she had built herself. Not for praise, not for pity, but because her younger brother, the only person she believed still had a chance at a future, was using it as his only classroom. They couldn't afford school. They didn't have the documents to enroll in any formal education. But still, Lyra taught through lines of code, simple drawings, and voice recordings. She whispered into her phone, late at night, after work. Her mother had once been a nurse, but after the fire, no institution offered compensation. There were no documents to prove she'd been at the hospital that day, no evidence that she had once had another child, one lost in the chaos of smoke and flame. They became ghosts in the administrative system, alive, but not existing, present, but unrecognized. Their family had no complete photograph. No birthday party was ever held with cake, candles, or kind words. Each year, on the day her mother believed was her birthday, Lyra would quietly draw a tiny cake on a piece of white paper, write her name next to a crooked candle, then fold it neatly and place it into a wooden box hidden behind an old curtain. It was the only way she knew how to keep something resembling a personal memory. No one knew. No one asked. No one cared. She became one of thousands of lost names drowned in the crowd of the unseen. But within that heavy darkness, one silent light refused to go out, a dream, to be seen, to be called by her real name, to live a life without hiding. And for that dream, she never let go. Lyra once believed that talent and hard work would be her ticket out of the suffocating cycle of poverty and invisibility. She carefully hand-wrote each scholarship application, attaching descriptions of the coding projects she had self-taught and built during long nights without light. But every response, if any came at all, was cold and identical, as if copied from the same script. We require high school transcripts, grade reports, letters of recommendation, financial documentation, and a valid social security number. Still, Lyra pressed on. She submitted code samples, data optimization programs she designed herself, to dozens of tech companies. Each line was an honest effort, each algorithm a product of long nights, extracting knowledge from a broken laptop and photocopied library books. But their automated recruitment systems rejected her before the first line of code was ever seen. You are not eligible without a recognized degree. When she tried to apply for a student loan to continue her education, the system exposed a bitter truth. The federal database could not verify her social security number because it didn't exist. Lyra wasn't just denied. She was erased from a game she was never even invited to play. That was when she understood a brutal reality. In this world, you can be a genius. You can hold the solution that could change an entire industry. But if you are not listed in the system, you don't exist. You are a shadow, a ripple that leaves no trace, a dream that passes through this world without ever being called by its name. And the harshest truth of all, no one goes looking for those without faces, without records, without numbers. The system doesn't trace what it never acknowledged. And you, a person like Lyra, must keep your head above the surface of your own ocean while no one on shore believes you're drowning. At the International Technology Conference, beneath the cold lights of the stage and the gaze of thousands expecting a grand keynote, Lyra didn't open her laptop. She didn't glance at the teleprompter behind her. Instead, she stepped up to the microphone and began to share the shattered pieces of a nameless childhood. Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes held firm. "I'm not a genius. I'm just a child who was left behind at the crossroads of her own life and had to draw the map to keep going." The entire hall fell silent. No one dared interrupt, because the story unfolding wasn't just spoken. It echoed with the memories of millions who had once been forgotten. "I don't need pity," Lyra continued. "I need something else. Something I've waited my whole life for someone to call me by my real name." Her voice caught, but then footsteps from the front row broke the hush. Celeste walked toward the stage, saying nothing, just stepping forward to take Lyra's hand. No introduction, no apology. That moment felt like two lost halves of a soul, finally finding each other after a lifetime of being apart. And then Celeste whispered, no microphone, just enough for Lyra to hear, "I'm sorry, my Lyra." The crowd erupted in applause, but to Lyra, nothing resounded louder than those three words. Because for the first time, someone hadn't just said her name. They had spoken it with recognition, with love, and with blood-born truth. For the first time, she wasn't a system error. She was a person, a real name, a heart, finally returned to where it belonged. Dante Vale stood behind the two sisters, not as the cold, commanding billionaire who once made boardrooms tremble, but as someone transformed. He no longer spoke of ROI, IPOs, or growth curves. Before a breathless, silent auditorium, he simply shared the moment that changed his life. I remember that day so clearly. A girl in a waitress uniform, hands still wet from rinsing glasses, pulled up a chair and read the contract clauses aloud in front of me as if she'd written them herself. At first, I thought she was being insolent, but then I realized she was the only one in the room brave enough to look a mistake in the eye because she had nothing left to lose. She had already lost everything long before that moment. Dante paused, scanning the room where CEOs, investors, and some of the brightest engineers in the world sat silent like students in their first lesson. Since that day, I no longer hire based on resumes. I hire based on eyes. Because if you've had to fight just to survive, you can fight to change the world too. He didn't need praise, he didn't wait for applause, but in that moment, he did what no strategic keynote could ever achieve. He gave a name, an identity, back to an entire invisible generation. A generation once overlooked by the system. A generation denied opportunity because they didn't have the right name. And now, because of him, because of Lyra, because of Celeste, they had a voice again. They had a chance. They had a rightful place. In the light, no longer the forgotten souls. As the spotlight bathed the stage and every microphone fell silent, only Lyra's final words echoed through the breathless stillness like a prayer, a reclamation of names for those who had never been called properly. You can call me a coder, a founder, whatever makes you comfortable in your definitions. But before any of that, I was a child left behind. And I'm still here, still learning, still building. She didn't speak with a triumphant voice, but with the quiet strength of someone who had waited a lifetime just to be heard. Because sometimes what you need most isn't an opportunity, it's a person. Someone patient enough to find you, not for what you have, but for who you are. That sentence didn't just bring the crowd to its feet. It made an entire industry, one that once worshipped Ivy League minds and Silicon Valley pedigrees, bow its head. For the first time, they understood intelligence is not found on a diploma, character is not in a resume, and human worth does not require validation to exist. That day, Gen.1, the platform co-founded by Lyra Celeste and Dante, was officially recognized as the world's leading humanitarian education initiative. Thousands of orphaned, undocumented, and invisible children began learning code language and life skills not to become someone else's talent, but to finally call themselves by a name. That was real. And from that day on, at every conference, every classroom, every employee badge at Valetech, one quiet quote was etched in the lower corner: I see you. I believe in you. And this time, we leave no one behind. Because the forgotten were never born to be background. They were born to rewrite history. I never thought a video or a story could make my heart feel like it was splitting apart. But when Lyra Quinn stepped onto that stage, when she said the only thing she had ever wished for in life was for someone to call her by her real name, I broke down. Not the kind of crying from mere emotion, but the cry of a mother who once had her child taken, and no one believed her. I gave birth at a small hospital outside the city during a blackout. When I awoke, the nurse told me the baby didn't make it. No one let me see the child. No records, no documents. When I asked, they said I was hallucinating from anesthesia, but I knew. I knew my child had existed. I heard the cry. I felt that tiny hand touch my cheek, and then it all vanished as if the child had never been here. I lived decades with a scar no one could see. Every year I remember that day. No birthday parties, no conversations. But in my heart, a child, nameless, faceless, undocumented, grew up with every year I grew older. And then I watched Lyra tell her story. About children without birth certificates, about a mother who had once been a nurse but couldn't prove her child existed. I saw myself. I saw my child. And I couldn't describe what I felt like. A lifetime of suffocated grief had finally been called out loud by someone brave enough to name it. When Celeste stepped forward and took Lyra's hand without a word, I trembled. Because I understood that some connections don't need explanation. Some children just need someone to stop, look them in the eyes, and say, I know you're here. I believe you deserve to exist. I used to think no one cared about the stories lost between misfiled hospital records and system errors. But Gen 1, for me, isn't just a tech project. It's a light, an apology to the past, a promise to the future, that some children will be called by their rightful names, learn in the right classrooms, and be held without doubt in their existence. Lyra said she doesn't want pity, and I believe her. But I also believe no one can watch her or children like her without feeling their heart contract. Not out of sympathy, but because we know we once turned away as those souls walked past us. And if one day my child, whatever they are, hears this message, I just want them to know, I never forgot you. I never stopped believing that you're somewhere out there writing your own story. Thank you, Lyra Celeste and Dante, not just for a powerful story, but for having the courage to open the door that the world had once locked shut. And this time, there were mothers like me waiting on the other side. Marta Elise Contreras. A mother once denied the right to say her child's name. If you're still here after every quiet breath and every tear that slipped down unnoticed, then this story isn't just about Lyra Quinn, Celeste Marin, or Dante Vale. It's about something far deeper. The value of a human life doesn't come from records, degrees, or family background. It comes from having lived, from enduring, and from standing back up even when the whole world turned away. Lyra was once invisible to every system. She was a shadow, drifting through the city, a torn-up draft, a child who had to write her own birthday on a piece of paper. And yet, with a cold lunchbox, an old phone, and hands that never stopped working, she rewrote history. Not just her own, but that of an entire generation without names. The lesson here is not about success. It's not about awards or prestigious stages. It's about something much simpler, yet far more profound. Sometimes the only thing a person needs is for someone to say their name, not with the voice of a system, but with the voice of trust, of recognition, of humanity. Because the children who were stolen when found and believed are the very ones who can change this world. If you've ever felt forgotten, ever waited for a nameless chance, or ever had to fight just to prove that you deserve the right to live like everyone else, then this story is for you. And if it touched you, if it made you think of yourself or someone you once saw being left behind in silence, then please don't keep it to yourself. Like it. Leave a comment. Share this story. Subscribe to Toch Story, where we don't just tell emotional stories, but help restore belief, compassion, and a promise that no one will ever be left behind again. Because somewhere out there, a child is still waiting to hear their name spoken for the very first time, the name that has always belonged to them. And if you are a mother, a father, or simply someone who has witnessed the silence of the system in the face of personal pain, then perhaps you understand better than anyone that there's nothing more terrifying than watching your child become invisible in a world this crowded. Lyra is not just a character in a story. She represents thousands, millions of children who never had their names written on a bed, never had their dreams recognized, and never had anyone stand up and say, "You matter." But sometimes it only takes one person who believes, one person who is willing to stop, listen, and open a door for the future to change. So let this story end, not with tears or a button click, but with action, with a new way of seeing those who have no name, with patience for someone who's never been given a chance. And if you can let Toch Story help you spread stories like this, stories not just meant to move you for a moment, but to change the way you live with more kindness, more depth, and more grace. Because in the end, we're all searching for the same thing, to be seen, to be called by name, and to be believed that we can change something.